Hi, I'm Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we'll be making focaccia with your new sourdough starter, part 4 of my sourdough series.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
On today's show, we will finally begin to bake with our new sourdough starter. And you just made it over the past 14 days. This is super exciting. Congratulations. I hope you are appreciating the moment. This is actually a very, very great accomplishment. This is a very exciting time. Your creation that you sort of nurtured as a parent over 14 days will become an incredibly delicious bread, and you made it with your own 2 hands and lots of love. Well done, you. You are such a good parent. All right. Before I give you an easy recipe for my focaccia, let's review what we learned over the past 3 shows very briefly, part 1 through 3 of my series about sourdough breads. In part 1, an introduction, we talked about the difference between a straight dough and a pre-ferment dough. In a straight dough, if you recall, all the ingredients are mixed together, made into a dough, it's left to rise, doubles in size, and it ferments. In a pre-ferment, a small part of that dough is made ahead, using flour, water, and yeast. This mixture is left to rise for several hours or even overnight, and then more ingredients are added to build the final dough. Then the dough is left to rise yet again. The entire pre-ferment is used up. It's gone. It's finished. In a sourdough starter, the starter is not all used up. After all the trouble you spent making the starter, you really need to save some of it so you can have it anytime you wish to bake incredible sourdough bread again. I usually save 2 cups of it in a clean, airtight container. I date it, I label it, and I keep it in my fridge. And I'm telling you, if the house goes down, up in smoke, I'm grabbing that starter and running. That's my most valuable possession, next to my family, of course, right? So in part 2 of the series, The Science of Sourdoughs, we discuss the interaction of yeast and bacteria and how they live side by side in a loving symbiotic relationship, each eating the sugars that the other will not. Yeast give off 2 byproducts of fermentation, carbon dioxide and alcohol, and bacteria give off lactic and acetic acids. These acids give that wonderful sour taste, that little something extra to a sourdough bread. And your bread will taste like no other because there are yeasts that are unique to the area in which you live. In part 3, creating a sourdough starter, we discussed exactly how to begin creating your very own science experiment, so to speak, your very own starter. And now, after 14 days of taking great care of your sourdough starter, you are ready to bake. I am so proud of you. A few tips before I give you my recipe. Number 1, remember that this starter can be used in any recipe calling for a sourdough starter. So for example, if you are reading another cookbook, if you are looking up something online and it says 2 cups of sourdough starter, you can use my sourdough starter as long as it's been fed and it's used between 12 and 15 hours after its last feed. You can use it in any recipe. It's wonderful and it works great. Now, to any sourdough starter bread recipe, I very often add about a half a cup of a grain or a seed, just to add texture and flavor, just to make things, a little interesting. Some of the things that I have added include things like wheat germ, maybe a little rye flour, flaxseed meal, poppy seeds, chia seeds, sesame seeds, millet, or even a gluten-free grain or seed. Anything you want. These add-ins can create crunch, texture. You could add nuts, even shredded cheese. There's a lot of things that you can add just to make your bread a little different. Tip number 3, remember the bread you make in the first few months with your starter It's only gonna get better, baby. The more you bake with the starter, the bread's flavor and texture is gonna get better and better over time. And I know because I have 3 very happy starters. Each are over 20 years old. My very first bread was lovely, but my 100th loaf is that much better. The starter ripens over time and greatly improves. Again, think of that well-aged bottle of wine. My final tip, which is the most important thing if I have taught you nothing, after going through the 14-day process to make your starter, remember to save 2 cups of it before you use it in a recipe. Please remember that, or you will not have any more starter left. All right, are you ready? We're ready to bake. Here is my recipe for olive, onion, and sweet pepper sourdough focaccia, and this recipe is from my book about professional baking. The first part of the recipe, I'm going to give you the topping, the olive, onion, and sweet pepper part, and that needs to be cooled, sort of cooked and cooled before, so let's get started on that. So in a sauté pan, you're going to heat a tablespoon of olive oil over medium-high heat, and you're going to add 1 yellow onion that's been peeled and thinly sliced, 2 minced garlic cloves, a half a teaspoon of granulated sugar, just to get a little caramelization in there, and 2 tablespoons of balsamic vinegar. You're going to stir it till it's blended and cook it for about 10 to 15 minutes, nice and low and slow until it's nice and caramelized, the mixture. Remove it from the heat and cool it down. Then you're going to add 1 large roasted sweet red bell pepper, thinly sliced, and a half a cup of coarsely chopped pitted Kalamata olives. If you like another type of olive, go ahead and add that instead. And then add an additional 1.5 tablespoons of olive oil. Just mix that up and set it aside. Now we're ready to blanket our beautiful focaccia that we are going to make now with this beautiful topping after. So you're ready? In the bowl of an electric mixer, you want to use your dough hook. You want to add 1.5 cups of 78-degree Fahrenheit water. Again, it's going to be cool water. You're going to add your starter, 1 cup of your baby potato sourdough starter. You're going to add, and this is a little different than you might be used to, I'm going to ask you to add 1/4 teaspoon of instant active yeast. What? This is a sourdough starter. It shouldn't need instant active yeast. And you are correct. In this particular recipe, I add a bit of yeast in addition to the starter, which is plenty to help this focaccia to rise. But this makes the focaccia just a touch lighter, and all you need is 1/4 teaspoon. Then I'm going to add 1.5 tablespoons of olive oil, 1/4 cup of raw wheat germ. Remember, that's some of the different ingredients that I add just to give a little bump up in the flavor. And 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour and 2 cups of white bread flour. And that's all I'm adding to the mixing bowl. You're going to mix with your bread hook on medium speed, 3 or 4 minutes until it's wet and sort of a sticky dough forms. So if it is a little wet, don't get upset. Stop your machine after about 3 to 4 minutes, and it won't look perfect. Don't add any more flour. Don't add any more flour. Do not do it. I used to do it, and I've regretted it. Don't do it. Cover the bowl with a clean kitchen towel. Let that dough rest in that mixing bowl for 10 minutes. This is known as an autolyse. Autolyse means to rest on its own. So it's a rest, a little siesta. So after we've brought everything together, this autolyse helps the flour absorb the water that you've added. And it also helps the gluten form properly. So remember, what is gluten? It's water and wheat-based flours, those gluten-forming proteins added together. And you can't form gluten unless these wheat-based proteins or these gluten-forming proteins come in contact with water, the gliadin and the glutenin. So if you give them a little time to sort of get, friendly with each other, the flour absorbs that water and forms much better gluten. It'll actually create a better dough and help in the kneading process in that you won't have to knead for as long. So once this 10 minutes has gone by, now you add your salt. Notice I didn't add the salt until now because that salt would sort of bind that dough up a little bit and make it sort of elastic and impermeable to that water as much as the flour can absorb it. You really want that salt to wait for a little bit before it goes in. So after the autolyse, that little baby rest, you're going to add 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. And I like kosher salt. You can use sea salt if you want, but I do like it better than table salt. A little coarser and gives a nice flavor. Mix it well with the dough hook to develop the gluten. Give it a few minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes maybe. The dough can also be put on a work surface and hand kneaded. And I love to do that. That is really what a true artisan bread is. You really want to get your hands in there and feel the dough. So once that dough has been hand kneaded, you want to put it back in the mixing bowl, cover it with plastic wrap, and allow it to rise for about 1 to 1.5 hours. The dough should be wet and still a bit sticky at this point, so don't worry about it. You don't want to add too much flour. That's how you get a dry loaf of bread or a dry focaccia. Now, after 1.5 hours, you'll notice this bread has grown. This dough has grown. You want to pour this dough onto a lightly greased rectangular sheet pan. Now I'm going to give you dimensions, but don't hold real tight to the dimensions. It should be a nice long, like a cookie sheet with sides, 15.5 by 10.5 by 1 inch sheet pan. You're going to pat the dough gently and evenly into the pan. If the dough doesn't go to the edges of the pan, don't worry about it because it may sort of be elastic and sort of boing back. Don't worry about it. Cover the dough with plastic wrap, and I like to spray my plastic wrap with a little nonstick cooking spray and put it directly over the dough and allow it to rise for another hour. The dough will get nice and puffy. Now at this point, while it's rising, preheat your oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a hot oven, and you're going to need this for this focaccia because it really gets a great crust on it. Carefully remove your plastic wrap from the dough and evenly scatter your deliciously cooled onion and pepper mixture that you've made for your topping all over the dough. Sprinkle the dough with some freshly cracked pepper and additional kosher salt or sea salt, and place the focaccia in the oven, and then immediately lower the oven temperature from 500 to 450 degrees Fahrenheit and bake it for 30 minutes until it's brown and crusty. And usually halfway through, after 15 minutes, I rotate it 180 degrees. And there you have it. You can enjoy your first bread from your very own sourdough starter. I hope you keep baking and enjoying this. And this particular recipe is also available on my website, chefgailsokol.com. Thanks for listening. Keep on baking. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, my YouTube channel, and my website, chefgailsokol.com. On my next show, we're going to be discussing the New York classic black and white cookie.